So before we get into the text today, tomorrow, as all of us know, is Memorial Day, and probably all of us know that it is a day of solemn remembrance, honoring the men and women of the armed forces who died in service of our country. So as part of our remembrance for them this morning, and also as an introduction to our time in the scriptures together, I want to share a couple things with you. One of the blessings of being 40 is, as a child of the 1980s, both Andrew and I, she's not 40, she will make that clear, she's not 40. But both Andrew and I had grandparents that served during World War II. And so I want to share a couple of stories this morning that are going to serve as an act of remembrance for us on Memorial Day weekend, as well as, I hope, tee up where we're headed this morning in the text. So the first story is actually told by my grandfather. He wrote a memoir called All Aboard. And the late James Godbold Sr. Served in the United States Marine Corps as a pilot in the Pacific Theater during World War II as part of a squadron of what was then called VMTB-232. You might know them as the Red Devils. I think we have a picture of some of those Red Devils, that gang of brothers. On the far left is James Godbold Sr., second lieutenant then. He would eventually become a full-bird colonel through the Korean War. So that is my grandfather, along with several other of the Red Devils. And there's a better picture, I think, of him close up. Nope, not that one. That one, yep. You can see it in the nose, I think. It's a prominent Godbold nose. Or if you've ever seen my cousin Dale Googer, that's basically him with a pilot, leather pilot helmet on. That's my grandpa. And not pictured in the previous shot was another Marine pilot, Second Lieutenant Joe Baird, a friend and fellow squadron member of my grandpa. And this morning, we're going to hear about him. This is excerpted from my grandfather's memoir. So this is in the Pacific Theater. The stage set is, this is right after Okinawa. So just after Okinawa, those are his words, was secured, Captain Noss, that was the operations officer and kind of the direct report for his squadron, led our division on an airfield strike located on a small island about 100 miles north of Okinawa, assigned me to a fly tail end Charlie, which is just the very back of a plane bombing formation, in order to evaluate and report the damage, which he did a lot of. My grandfather was a very good spotter. He had kind of eagle eyes when he was up there. He did all kinds of things. It's crazy. You should read his book. Our mission was to do as much damage as possible to the already heavily bombed airstrip of this small little island in order to prevent use by the Japanese. The U.S. Navy had the island pretty well strangled by a blockade that prevented delivery of supplies or reinforcements, and for that matter, escape by sea. However, the Japanese troops were pretty well dug in and prepared to fight. It appeared that their entire battery of anti-aircraft weapons was zeroed in on our bomb run, and while several turkeys, that's what they called their planes, received some damage, the plane just ahead of me, piloted by Second Lieutenant Joe Baird, sustained a direct hit about halfway into his dive. I immediately yelled, "Joe, pull out now!" He did not and was hit again. But after the second hit, he still managed to open his bomb bay doors and drop his load straight down the airstrip. The plane never veered, and it hit the far end of the strip at about 35-degree angle. The impact was followed by an explosion that spewed bits and parts of the TBM. That's the plane that they flew, the TBM Avenger Grumman, TBM or TBF, depending on who made it, Avenger, fighter bomber, torpedo bomber. And it sent the debris of that plane 100 feet in the air. Captain Noss ordered the division to join on me as he rolled into a steep dive at one of the anti-aircraft emplacements and blew it to Kingdom Come with a salvo of 4 solid-head 6-inch rockets. By the time he reclaimed the lead, the other 5 TBMs had reported flyable and enough fuel to make it back to base. That evening, following debriefing, Joe's tent mates packed up his personal items and delivered them to the chaplain. So during its participation in the operations throughout World War II, VMTB-232 lost 49 Marines and 17 aircraft. One of those was Second Lieutenant Joe Baird, friend of my grandfather, James Godbold. He died courageously, doing his job for his country. And today, we remember him. Perhaps even more to the point and more poignant is the story of my wife Andrea's great uncle, my mother-in-law, Cindy's uncle, Staff Sergeant Herbert Engelmore. We have a picture of him. That was the other one. Yep, that's him. Who served in the United States Army during World War II, but in the European theater. He was an NCO in the Army's 324th Infantry Regiment during the Allies' invasion of France and made it all the way to the border of Germany. We don't have his story in his own words because he was killed in action in January of 1945. What we do have is the letter from the regiment's chaplain informing his father of his son's death, which I will read for us this morning and will be on your screen. Dear Mr. Engelmore, it was my honor to serve as chaplain in the regiment with your son, Staff Sergeant Herbert L. Engelmore, who was killed in action in France. May I express the sincere regret and deepest sympathy of our entire unit in this time of sorrow. Your son was a fine man and a good soldier. He gave his life for the liberty and freedom of all of us. Greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. He was given an honorable burial by a Protestant chaplain of the United States Army, and his body now lies at rest in a military cemetery in eastern France, there awaiting the resurrection. Again, we express our deepest sympathy, and we pledge together that the memory of our dead will ever be sacred. Sincerely yours, Law P. Knox, Chaplain, USA. Today, we remember Staff Sergeant Herbert Engelmore, and not only him, but all the men and women of valor who courageously give their lives in service of this country to protect the freedoms that we enjoy and hold so dearly here in the United States. And this letter, which my wonderful wife reminded me of Friday night, was just too poignant not to share, not only in light of Memorial Day, but also because of the resurrection hope that Chaplain Law P. Knox underscored. And like I said, it just tees us up too well for our passage today. So I'm going to pray for us one more time, and then we're going to head where we're headed. Heavenly Father, we do thank you for this wonderful country. We thank you that I can stand here unafraid to preach your word faithfully. Lord, help me to do that well. And Lord, we thank you for those who have given their lives courageously, men and women of valor, to protect this very freedom that we now enjoy. May you help us always to be grateful, to remember well, and to always trust, not in governments or men and women in uniform, but Christ alone. And at the same time, may we remember many of these people who have given their lives courageously had that wonderful resurrection hope, and we are grateful for that together in Christ Jesus. Amen. So I think now we're ready to open our Bibles, and if you would, go to Acts 22. We're going to be just the last verse of that, and then into the first 11 of chapter 23. And if you are new this morning, or you're dropping in and haven't been here in a while, or, I don't know, just lived life for like 6 days like I did since the last time we preached, you may need a refresher on where we are and where we have been and get reoriented into this story. So I'm going to do that briefly, and then we are going to be in the text together. So while you're turning there, let me just kind of remind us where we've been and where we're headed. So Paul, the apostle, has been prompted in the Spirit to go to Jerusalem. We saw that in chapter 20. And he is told not to go by his friends several times, insistent, most recently by a prophet in Acts 21 named Agabus, which I think is a great name for a kid, anybody who is expecting. So just, you could call him Ag or her, Aggie. You could, if he's a football player, you call him Bus, so. But Paul insists he must and is willing to die if need be. He must go. And so Paul arrives in Jerusalem, and he sees the brothers, and they're sort of nervous for him too, even there, because of all the Gentile stuff that he's been doing over the last decade, right? And the last time he was there, the Jerusalem Council was happening, and this Gentile thing was just getting started. Now it's been another decade or more since that has happened, and so they're nervous for him. He, therefore, agrees to undergo Jewish ritual purification, okay? So he decides to take a vow, shave his head, do all this stuff with some other men that were already doing that, basically to placate some of the Jewish factions that want to see him charged with something. They're looking for anything to sort of pin on him because they know what he's been doing. And so he tries to do this. Paul himself talks about being all things to all people, so he's willing to go do this. But he doesn't even make it through, and we saw last week when Trey preached it doesn't work. Before he can complete it, he's arrested, and he's brought before the Sanhedrin by a Roman tribune. So a Roman tribune, we learned last week, is kind of like a captain of hundreds of soldiers, right? So he's a Roman official above a centurion, and he comes and says, okay, we've got to figure out who this guy is because he's causing trouble. And so Paul is asked to explain himself, and he gives his testimony of how Jesus has changed his life. That was what we saw last week. So the greatest defense is your own testimony, right? That was our application, to share your story, to be unafraid as you share your own story. And so as soon as he talks about the part of his story where Christ tells him to go take the gospel to the Gentiles, there's a huge uproar within the Sanhedrin, which again is this big kind of conclave of high priests. There's 71 of them, right? And he's standing before them, and they all get mad at him because he's talking about going to Gentiles, which is what they're mad about. They think that they're accusing him of bringing Gentiles into the temple and doing all these things, just totally flouting the Jewish law and tradition. And so Paul is taken away by Roman soldiers to be examined, which is a really kind word for tortured. But he doesn't get flogged because kind of right as they're getting ready to do it, he's like, by the way, you really ready to flog a Roman citizen? And they're like, wait, what? And so then there's this kind of exchange with the tribune at the end, and he's like, okay, wait, you're a citizen? That kind of changes the game here. We got to take a step back and figure out, who this guy is, what he's really doing, if he's really a citizen. He's like, because I bought my citizenship for like a lot of money. He was like, I was born into it, whatever, So that sort of saves his bacon, or at least saves his back from becoming literal bacon at that moment. And so that's where we are. Now, we're picking up at the end of that chapter 22, verse 30, and I'm going to read our passage, which is verse 30 of 22, and then the first 11 verses of 23. So if you would, follow along as we read God's word this morning. It says, "But on the next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he," that is the tribune, "unbound him and commanded the chief priests and all the council to meet. And he brought Paul down and set him before them. And he looked intently at the council. Paul said, 'Brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day.' And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, 'God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law? And yet, contrary to the law, you order me to be struck.' Those who stood by said, 'Would you revile God's high priest?' And Paul said, 'I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people.' Now when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, 'Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial.' And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. Then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees' party stood up and contended sharply, 'We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or angel spoke to him?' And when the dissension became violent, the tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him away from among them by force and bring him into the barracks. The following night, the Lord stood by him and said, 'Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome.'" May God bless today the reading and the hearing of his holy word. So we're going to, now that we've read it, let's kind of break this down and just take it in pieces because there's a lot going on here. So back at the beginning in verse 30, we kind of have the scene reset, right? It says, "But on the next day." So a day has passed. Desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he, that is the tribune, unbound him, that is Paul, and commanded the chief priests and all the council, that is the Sanhedrin, and he brought Paul down and set him before them. So it's interesting that the tribune perceives that there's a deeper reason why Paul is being accused. He's desiring to know the real reason, the text says. So this guy, who we will later learn in the book, is named Claudius Lysias. And he is interested, if not intrigued by Paul himself. And of course, there are echoes of Pilate and Jesus here, I think we can already see, which Luke himself also chronicles in his gospel. But he's, if not intrigued by Paul, he is at least willing to entertain that there's more going on here than meets the eye. And because this dude is a Roman, he's going to give him some more chances, right? Some more treatment to plead his case. And we also have a bit of Roman Jewish legalities now at play. So this is pretty important for our context, and it has to be kept in mind because of this now kind of new custody issue that we're confronted with. Because Lysias is taking the initiative and is using Roman procedures, not Jewish ones, okay? So what has occurred to this point, even before this, is kind of a pre-trial hearing. And even now, though Paul is going to use the word trial, that's not really what's going on. This is still kind of a hearing. This is fact-finding. Lysias is trying to figure out what Paul is actually being accused of, what the charges are. Is there any truth to them? Because as far as he's concerned, Paul's a Roman citizen, and whatever's going to be done with him is going to be up to him. So because he's also a Jew, he is giving Jewish leadership, because he perceives, rightly, that this is some sort of inter-party fight, right? There's different sectarian things going on here, and so he's interested in that. But already we've had one try, and it ends in chaos. So he's like, well, everybody's had a good night's rest. Let's try again and see if it gets better. It doesn't. So the only thing that has changed is that Lysias is just inclined to give Paul more of an ear. And so because he's still trying to discern the facts, and because he doesn't fully understand the religious issues involved, being a Roman and not a Jew, he wants to hear the rest of Paul's story and what the charges against him are. And so Paul, again, stands up. This is verse 1. And he says, and looking intently at the council, Paul says, brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. Now, this is an interesting way to begin because the expression good conscience is a very Pauline, very Paul-like expression. He uses that same phrase several times in 1 Corinthians and Romans, especially, which would have already been written by this time. So this totally tracks with how Paul thinks, with how he talks. And what he simply means here is that all his life, even before he knew Christ, he had tried to live righteously. First as a Pharisee, as a Jew, and now as an apostle of Jesus Christ, the Messiah. He has tried in good conscience to say and do the right thing. So that's what he means. He goes, my whole life I've tried to make the right choice. Now, given the charges, that is not received well. And in verse 2, we see the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. So already 3 verses in, not really going any better than before. One could argue maybe just kind of picked up where they left off, and it is now just turning into physical violence. So we don't know whether the high priest Ananias here gave a verbal command or a signal. The text doesn't really say, but we know it's not Ananias himself who actually strikes him. It's the people near Paul who strike him. And Paul's response to being struck is, let's charitably say, very firm. And it may even reflect that Paul lost his temper a bit. If I had been punched in the mouth, it might have been worse. So Paul says in verse 3, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. The old whitewashed wall insult that we all use. It's classic. No, it's reminiscent of the term that Jesus uses to describe the Pharisees in Matthew 23. He calls them whitewashed tombs in Matthew 23. And there, Christ meant that as less of an insult and more of a prophetic judgment of woe. It's part of a passage of 7 woes. And so the reference there was the idea of a tomb. Remember, and tombs aren't just, they're not graves like we would think of it. Like, remember, there's stones and, big kind of ornate or very simple. But the idea of whitewashing them means it keeps it clean looking. It keeps it nice looking. The same way we would put flowers at a graveside today, you would put whitewash on a tomb back then. And Christ's whole point was, hey, a whitewashed tomb still has a dead, decaying person on the inside. That's just a veneer. That's just something on the outside trying to hide what's really going on in the inside. And the point was, of course, Christ and God the Father looks at the heart doesn't care about all the outward ritual and all the things that the Pharisees were doing, all the trappings, all the additions they'd made to the law, all the pious things that they did. He was like, no, that's not what we care about. We care about the heart, and on the outside you look great, and on the inside you're decaying. But the term whitewashed wall is also biblical, but far older, and it's employed by prophets. Both Isaiah and Ezekiel use this expression, and both of them describe something similar. And it's a wall that has begun to rot, but rather than being repaired, you just put another coat of paint on it to hide the rot. Kind of like the fascia board at Evan Godbold's house. Maybe I should call Jack Watkins to help me put some hardy plank up eventually. Not just a worship guy, guys. So I think the idea is you can slap some paint on it, right? Maybe even if you're like me, just put like a little silicone caulk there and just paint it over, and you could like stick your finger into it, right? That may or may not be what's going on under a bathroom window in my house. So there are things like that, right? It's like it's never done. Home ownership, 40. So there are things where we can see the outside and it looks one way, but on the inside it's rotting and it's falling apart. So here the idea is, right, you're the high priest. You're a pillar. You're the guy that's supposed to have all the answers, be the top dog, kind of the equivalent of, the ruler, not secularly, right, because they're under Roman authority, and they've had Herod, and now they're kind of got all these other Roman people over them in this time. But at least as far as religious authority is concerned, the high priest is supposed to be the bulwark, the guy, the cornerstone. And calling him a whitewashed wall, well, that's a pretty big insult, because they know what that means. They know the references, right? And so, this man who seemed to be a sure and steady structure within the Sanhedrin is really about to crumble, because he also says, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. So when God strikes you, even if you're the most bulwark, sturdy foundation, right, you're still going to fall. But if you're a whitewashed wall, God can just go, pink, right, which is going to happen soon. The Sanhedrin, as we know it, is less than a decade away at this point of total destruction, or maybe slightly more than a decade, depending on when we're dating this. But the idea is, within plus or minus 10 years, all of this is changing. So some people think that this might be a prophetic utterance from Paul, too, similar to Jesus' 7 woes, right? Maybe. I mean, he also just got punched in the mouth. So he's probably insulting him because he got hit in the mouth. But the symbolism makes sense when he's explaining his grievance. He says, are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law, you order me to be struck? And so Paul's beef isn't just that he got hit in the mouth, although that's probably the primary beef, but you or I would be upset, and we can all understand Paul's anger and contempt for the person who's treating them this way, especially if being treated this way isn't justified. But Paul himself points out not just that it's bad form to hit someone in the mouth, which is just generally true, but also that speaking to defend yourself in front of a court that has not rendered judgment and applying corporal punishment, physical punishment, is against the law as handed down by Moses. This is from Deuteronomy 25, 1 through 2. This is probably what he was referring to. It says, if there is a dispute between men and they come into the court, and this would qualify as that, and the judges decide between them, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty, then, if the guilty man deserves to be beaten, the judge shall cause him to lie down and be beaten in his presence with a number of stripes in proportion to his offense. That is not what happens here. He is trying to give a defense and gets punished before any judgment has been rendered. And so he's basically saying, hey, God's going to strike you because you're not obeying his own law. And Paul's not even really on trial yet, we've already established. The Sanhedrin is not even really acting as a court body, so their authority is even less than would be. And this is just a hearing, and a Roman one. So crimes have been accused, no formal charges have been brought, and it can't be without Rome directly involved. And even then, if he had been charged, he'd not yet been convicted. So Paul's simply pointing out that he's been beaten without guilt, which is against the law. Here's the problem, though, which is verse 4. Those who stood by and said, would you revile God's high priest? So now there's a little bit more to unpack. So Paul made an oopsie as well. Remember how nice things started. He calls them brothers, talks about living in good conscience, and then all of a sudden, even though he starts out charitably, in the words of Mike Tyson, great theologian, everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And it's true. Paul had a plan. Approach the Sanhedrin with humility. Keep being the guy that does everything in good conscience. Then he gets hit in the mouth. And his adrenaline starts pumping, just as yours or mine would. And his instinct is to fight back. Now, there's 70 plus people and guards and all the things. So he's not going to physically strike who struck him, right? But verbally, he might bow up, don't you think? And maybe just enough of that lizard brain kicks in and that his good conscience kind of just backburners a bit. And he lobs a spicy insult in retaliation. Now, it also happens to be true, and so that's why we're like, well, is it prophetic? And we're like, well, some of the best insults are true, right? So, as is pointed out here, this is an insult to the high priest, which is also against the Mosaic law. Verse 5 tells us that this is a problem. So Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall never speak evil of a ruler of your people. So Paul does two things here. He gives an excuse for his behavior. He didn't know that this person talking or that gave the order was the high priest. And then he cites the passage that prohibits such an offense, which is Exodus 22:28. And we can kind of probably take these in reverse order. So first, the citation does two things. One, it shows Paul is willing to admit that he overstepped. And it implied heavily here is that he too has now at least accidentally broken the law, if not willfully, and would not have done that if he hadn't lost his temper to begin with. So that's kind of the undercurrent here. And two, it shows Paul's opponents that he is well-versed in matters of the law. So it also kind of proves his, mettle a bit. He's like, hey, I've lived up in good conscience. And they're like, well, you did this wrong. He's like, oh, you're right. That is wrong. I would not revile God's ruler if I had known that. But Paul gives this rather strange excuse at the front end, which is that he says he doesn't know Ananias is the high priest, which would seem odd at first glance. And there are probably three potential explanations worth mentioning, because you're like, Paul is a pretty big guy in the Jewish culture, Pharisee world. How would he, with all of his ties to Jerusalem, the fact that he was still a good Jew and regularly traveled back to Jerusalem and knew people in Jerusalem, how does he not know who the high priest is? That's a weird thing to say. So we've got, there are more than three, but I think there are three good explanations, so that's what we're going to focus on. So the first one is we take Paul's words completely at face value. He didn't know the guy that gave the orders was the high priest. It's been more than a decade, almost 2 decades probably, since he's been in that room, maybe more than 2 decades since he was actually in that room with a totally different high priest, which was when he was still called Saul and Stephen was up there, right? So that was Caiaphas, that wasn't Ananias. So it was a different composition. Imagine, just extrapolate out, any governing body, the Texas State Senate 20 years later. It's like, how many of those guys are the same, right? Like, it would probably be a lot of different people. So it could just be he just doesn't know the guy. Or at least doesn't know what he looks like, depending on how formal this thing was, right? So he was once one of them, and Caiaphas was a high priest at that time, but he doesn't know who this dude Ananias is, maybe. And maybe he's never laid eyes on him at all. And he's just literally like, oh, that guy, I didn't know that was the high priest. I'm sorry. It could be as simple as that. The only hitch with that is I've got a couple of pictures. Seth, you can put the first one up of just what the Sanhedrin probably looks like. So this is the Sanhedrin. You see the high priest up there. Let's see if I got any laser left in this. It's that guy on the big throne right there in front of the guy that's standing there. So you're like, I didn't know that was the high priest. Maybe it's weird to say. Maybe. But there could be other reasons for this, okay? One of the things is the location of the Sanhedrin was this place called the Hewn Stone, the Chamber of Hewn Stone. You can go to the next slide there, Seth. So that's right there. What do you notice about this for our temple experts? This is a place that Romans can't go. Right? So there's a tribune and soldiers and people that have sent him here. And if you're here, you're inside. This boundary is the consecrated area of the temple. This is court of women. This is the inner part of the temple, right? Out here is the Gentile area where everyone can go. And so you're like, okay, if there's tribunes here, where are they? Are they not in that building then? Are they somewhere else? Totally possible. Or even more possible, the next one, is that it's built something like this. There's the wall right there, and there's the Nicanor gate right there going into the temple, and it's kind of half in, half out. for purposes of, being built by Herod, who was a Roman sympathizer and knew that Romans would probably want to go in before the high priests. And so the basilica might be like that. This is just an artist rendering, and this is a guess. We don't have a ton of archaeological evidence because, you can't go dig there. But this might be kind of a half in, half out, and literally there's a consecrated side where even the high priest wouldn't sit on a consecrated side based on what we know of the law, right? They're not supposed to. So they'd be seated somewhere out there anyway if they were judging and doing things. So just a little cool, thing. Maybe it was something like that. Romans could walk right up there, and go in there, and they'd have a quick escape hatch to go around the block, not even around the block, around the temple to the fortress that is later referred to as the barracks. So it's possible that that's what's going on. So Paul just may have never laid eyes on the guy before, and he doesn't know who the guy is, and maybe they're not in a formal arrangement, right, to where they're all seated like that. Maybe they're all standing around because somebody got up to strike him. Did they get up off their thing and be like, bam, and then just go and sit back down? So it seems like maybe they're standing somewhere else. Maybe they weren't meeting in there. Different times with different Roman officials, they may have just been like, hey, don't meet in there. You need to conduct your business with Roman soldiers out in the general court somewhere else. There were tons of places, tons of porticos, things where they could have gone. And if it was less formal like that, because again, not an actual judgment, who knows? But speaking of laying eyes on the guy, a second theory is a bit more speculative and just requires some extra biblical interpretation. But it's thought by many scholars that later in life, Paul's eyes were failing him. And so, though it's never explicitly stated and only has some tenuous support, Paul writing with big letters, for instance, in Galatians 4, and the fact that his letters were usually dictated to a scribe and could indicate poor eyesight, those sorts of things. So maybe Paul just couldn't see very well. And if, again, we talked about it doesn't say whether he verbally gave an order for these people to strike him or if he just motioned for it. So if he just motioned for somebody to strike him, and then he's like, he's just looking kind of generally at a blur of people, you will be struck, you whitewashed wall. And they're like, did you know that was the high priest? And he's like, oh, no, I had no idea that the high priest was the one who gave that order. So it could be something as simple as that. He just could have been yelling the insult into a general location. Or third, he knew who gave the order and knew that person had broken the law. So Paul's remark is somewhat ironic in the sense that Paul is trying to show the high priest is not really the representative of the people of God anymore. And that what's coming is fully him being taken away, taken off the board, because Jesus is our high priest. And because this high priest, Ananias, is so perceived by the people, Paul backs off and recants and said, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know that was the high priest, just so he can kind of keep going. So all of these are possible. You can believe any of them that you want. I think the blindness one has the most leaps beyond the text, so I'm not super partial to it. I think Paul being deliberately ironic and rhetorical totally tracks with what we know about him elsewhere, and his less than apologetic apology means I probably lean a little bit more there, as this reads more as a way to diffuse the situation and hurry it along rather than a genuine moment of confusion. But it's entirely possible that this is one of those moments where he simply steps in it and realizes it's too late, and he's like, oh, I didn't know that was the high priest. My bad. And so no matter what you pick, I think it's important that we just say a little more certainly than the reason that it's likely that Paul sinned in this exchange, broke the law. He got angry when he shouldn't have, right? And Paul's example here is not really presented in the text as commendable. Now, the insult is presented as true, and it does happen. But this is not the quiet, suffering servant who opened not his mouth, or even the first martyr Stephen, calling the same council stiff-necked people. Paul starts out trying to take the high road, calls everybody brothers, then he gets hit in the mouth, and then he hurls an insult. We've got something different going on here. So I think it's important that we not lionize somebody like Paul, who was just like us. He could totally get angry, especially if you got punched in the face. You might get angry. Now, we've seen other instances where he doesn't, so we don't know what particularly sets him off. But do we ever know what really sets somebody off? Maybe he didn't sleep that well under guard in chains the night before. Maybe they dragged him at 6 a.m., and that was how he woke up. We don't have all the information here, but it's important to realize that this is not Paul at his best. It's not him at his worst, but it's not him at his best. And so we know that he also recovers after this verse because he starts using the term brothers again. He's like, I'm going to recalibrate. Brothers, So we see that in verse 6. It says, now when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out to the council, brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. So, when he perceived is an interesting phrase. It probably just means that it came to mind. Paul knows the political makeup of the Sanhedrin. That's not new to him. But it probably had not occurred to him until that moment, and that it might be to his advantage. So, there are two main Jewish groups in power. If you have spent any time in the scriptures, particularly in the Gospels, you've probably heard of these guys. So, the Sadducees are part of the priestly class of the nation of Israel, and now the Roman nation of Judea. And their religious views and political views are very different than the Pharisees, who we have heard a lot about in the Gospels. Sadducees too, but mostly Pharisees. And these Sadducees are pretty much Roman sympathizers. They're all right with the temple. They get to be priests in it. They like that it was built by Rome, given to them by Herod, who's kind of a puppet Jewish king, now gone, but they still got their temple, so that's fine. They're still in power, so that's fine. And they're interested in temple worship and priesthood because that's their thing. These guys are descended from Levites, and they have this fancy Roman temple. And importantly, they don't believe in the resurrection. They are much more concerned with kind of the now, the temporal things, the things of this world, Jewish faith and practice as related to temple worship. The minority group, and I say minority group on the Sanhedrin, are the Pharisees, and this is the group that Paul was from. And now the gospel accounts sort of color our perception a bit because Jesus so often went toe-to-toe with these guys, engaging in disputes. But in general, they are the more liked Jewish group in Paul's day. They are more liked by kind of the everyman, right? They have a lot of public goodwill as people who actually want to know, live, and teach the law. That's what they think of as Pharisees. They are the rabbis that Jesus himself is called. It's why they're called teachers of the law in the Gospels. They were the ones out with the people teaching the law. After the temple was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70, the bulk of the Sadducees obviously have nothing to do, and they sort of fade away into obscurity, and modern Judaism as we know it, rabbinic Judaism, descends from these guys, the Pharisees, the ones that teach the law, and who give an interpretation of Torah that allows you to live your life. Kind of similar to what Jesus was doing. In fact, it's probably worth mentioning that Jesus gets called rabbi a lot, and even though he was going toe-to-toe with the Pharisees, a lot of people who didn't know any better were probably like, oh yeah, he's just like this new Pharisee guy, he's really good, his name's Jesus, right? So like, he was way more similar to a Pharisee than he was a Sadducee. And it says that, Paul realizes that these two guys these two groups are here, and that the Sadducees have the most political power. Probably about 2/3 of the Sanhedrin was Sadducees, and only 1/3, was Pharisees, even though in the kind of the populist land, that their favor might be reversed. The Sadducees had the political power with Rome. And so Paul used to be in this club, and he knows that this club believes in a Messiah. Which Sadducees, we don't know a ton about them beyond the biblical accounts. Not a lot of that survived after the temple was destroyed. But it says here that they don't believe in the resurrection and that they don't believe in spirits or different kind of, you can think of it like demons and angels and things like that. And what that probably means isn't just that they don't believe in those things all told, but they're just not concerned with them. They're concerned with temple worship. They're concerned with these temporal things that have to happen here and now. And they definitely are not trying to pump up a Jewish belief in Messiah while getting cozy with Rome. So these guys, the Pharisees, believe in a Messiah, and more importantly, they believe in the resurrection of the dead. Two primary ingredients to the gospel. And so this might be Paul's most important moment of his defense. So remember, again, he's not been charged with this. He says, it is with the respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. He hasn't been charged with that, but that's what he says. This is what's really going on. So remember, Lysias wants to know, hey, what's really going on? That's kind of the whole point. And he goes, hey, here's what's really going on. All right, so don't miss that. Paul tells them, hey, what they're really concerned about is that I believe in the resurrection of the dead, okay? And that's why I'm on trial. And so this is Paul's most important kind of defense in this whole exchange, because those false charges have nothing to do with it, which is just that there's a, Paul's been bringing Gentiles into the temple to worship. They're going past the boundary of the consecrated portion of the temple and bringing them into places that they can't be. He didn't do that. He did come to Jerusalem, the city, with Gentiles, but he didn't bring them into the temple. So even the charges are trumped up. They're not real. And Paul knows that. And so he's framing this, and indeed, Luke's account here on out is really being framed more as the gospel itself being put on trial, and Paul being its chief advocate. So don't miss that. That's what is beginning here in the narrative structure of Acts from here on out. And so the hope and the resurrection is likely a figure of speech called, I can't even say it, it's like a hendiadys. It's a type of thing where, like, we would say, nice and warm. It's like two words joined by and, right? So the hope and the resurrection of the dead. It's like nicely warm is kind of what you really mean when you say nice and warm, right? So they go together and they modify each other, but you use and instead of the typical like kind of adjective or adverbial sort of phrase, okay? So it's important to know that what it's probably more like is something closer to the hope of the resurrection. I'm on trial for the hope of the resurrection, or even I'm on trial for resurrection hope, okay? That's what he's saying. So don't think of them as separate things. They are the same thing being joined by that figure of speech. And so the idea here is I am on trial for my hope in the resurrection of the dead and all that entails, which I would like to tell you about, right? He is teeing up sharing the gospel. And we'll find, just spoilers, each time he does this from here on out, it gets more specific, right? The gospel, Luke is building this whole case, right? He's got a thing that he's doing as a writer and the Holy Spirit is inspiring him to do, which is build his case for the gospel. So here he says, here's why I'm on trial. I'm on trial for my belief in the resurrection hope. That's why I'm on trial. And when he said this is verse 7 through 9. When he said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but Pharisees acknowledge them all. Then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees partly stood up and contended sharply. We find nothing wrong in this man. What if a spirit or an angel spoke to him? So here again, there are these differences being pointed out. So it's not that they don't believe in spirits or angels, like I said. It's that they don't believe in their daily activity like this. You might even kind of say it's like people who believe that certain spiritual gifts are active and people who believe that they cease. This kind of thing is going on a little bit. He's like, Pharisees are all over the idea that, yeah, demons are possessing people, stuff that we read about in the Gospels, that angels show up, stuff is happening in Acts. Angels show up and tell you things and give you visions and all that. Pharisees are cool with that. Sadducees are not. They're like, no, you come to the temple and you worship and you make your sacrifices and that's what you do. You listen to us. They're trying to hold on to that temporal idea of this is what we've always done and God is doing something new. And the Pharisees are a little bit more here for it. They're a little more open to it. And so some of you may remember that the last time where we had a passage, I just showed a movie clip of the whole thing. So a passage like this where a guy was before the Sanhedrin and I showed you Stephen and I just said, hey, let's just watch the whole atmosphere, the whole tension. Because here, what's really going on is Paul is maybe, you might look at it and think like, maybe Paul's just trying to get them to fight amongst themselves so you can just kind of like slowly back away, and be like, hey, Romans, can you? Because it kind of feels like that. He's like, hey, I'm on trial for this thing. I know you guys both fight about this a lot. And then it's like that Looney Tunes cartoon where like the big fight cloud comes and all the limbs come out and then Paul is the Bugs Bunny character that just like steps out of it and then like the rest of them fall off a cliff. So maybe it's a little bit like that. And so I wanted to show just another reenactment. This one's a lot shorter, and it's by a different filmmaker, but I think it's worth our time. So we can just take a look at it.
Can we talk? That's right. It is beautiful.
All right. The different filmmaker was me. I'd made that out of Ninja Turtles 2, Secret of the Ooze. That came to mind immediately when Paul's like, hey, this thing, and then they're like, I'll fight, and then he just like, obviously that's not what's really going on, but, any chance to throw in Michelangelo is helpful. So I think, I don't know about you, when I first read this, it does seem like Paul is sort of trying to get them to fight amongst themselves a bit, and maybe just being a little clever. And I was sort of convinced that that was what was going on, and then I read a commentator by the name of Ben Witherington. He helped me see it differently. He says, one must not view the Sanhedrin scene as nothing more than an example of Paul's being clever by using a divide and conquer approach, setting his opponents at each other's throats. Paul does not merely wish not to be judged by the Sanhedrin or Jewish authorities, though that is also true. He does wish to be judged by the Roman authorities. This is so because he knows that if they can be convinced that the dispute is over matters of Jewish law and belief, and not over some offense deemed serious or treasonable under Roman law, that, barring a miscarriage of justice as a Roman citizen, he should be in a good position legally. And that's just true. So I think that's right. His audience isn't really these guys. It's the tribune, Lysias. So if he can get this tribune to see, hey, this is what's really going on, and he can show them the infighting and show them the fact that they don't even agree about why he's here and what's going on, and a third of them are all of a sudden like, hey, maybe he's fine, like that sort of paints the whole thing a bit differently. And rather than escape the violence, this doesn't actually help like him do the Michelangelo thing and jump, not the sculptor, the Ninja Turtle, and jump out of the thing, right? They start playing a literal kind of tug of war on him. And that's when Lysias kind of goes, oh, wait, we got to end this. We got to step in. In verse 10, it says, when the dissension became violent, the tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him away from among them by force and bring him into the barracks. So it looks to him like Paul might literally be torn apart by this argument. And so the tribune intervenes just to keep him safe. And he has the soldiers taken back to what Luke refers to as the barracks. And the word barracks doesn't really conjure what we're talking about, but this is likely an adjoining structure on the Temple Mount called Antonia, which is literally a fortress connected at the corner of the outer court of the temple, the court of the Gentiles. So it's this big old fortress that's used to defend the temple, connected to the temple complex. And so it's still really nearby where they are, but it's a completely Roman portion controlled by Rome, and not technically part of the temple. So it's the closest safe place, and it is almost certainly the place where Pilate questioned Jesus. So again, that's more parallels that we're sort of seeing with what's going on with Paul and what went on with Christ here. But that wasn't the last time that Jesus appeared there, because in verse 11, it says, the following night, the Lord, that is Jesus, stood by him and said, take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome. So Paul receives a vision of the Lord standing beside him, not seated on a throne, but standing by him. That image brings many connotations for us. An advocate for a besieged man on trial, a friend supporting another friend through adversity. And then he speaks a word to him. Take courage. This is the same phrase that is translated elsewhere as take heart, and even sometimes do not be afraid. But it is worth noting that the underlying definition remains the same for each use. To be firm or resolute in the face of danger or adverse circumstances. So take courage. Why? For as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome. Take courage because you're not done yet. Paul has faced death already. He's already been in prison. He's been stoned. He's been beaten and left for dead outside of a city and much more. But for reasons unclear, Paul experiences a vision of Jesus standing by him this time. It could be that Paul was beginning to doubt, that punch on the mouth and nearly being ripped apart may have had something to do with that. So Jesus says, hey, I'm here. Take courage. It's not over yet. Keep being faithful. That has huge implications for us this morning. We have one application, and it's live lives marked by Christ-fueled courage. I want to talk about what I mean by Christ-fueled courage, because I sort of have three ideas that support what I'm talking about. So the first is that Christ-fueled courage trusts in God's means and timing. Christ-fueled courage trusts in God's means, his way, and his timing when he decides. This marks a turning point for us in the story of Acts, and is certainly a turning point for Paul. There are no more miraculous releases from prison. There are no more angels dressed in white waving a hand over a door, or chains falling off while people are singing hymns. That's done. We do have a miracle here, but it is not a miracle that frees Paul. That divine power that rescues from prison has become a powerful presence that enables the witness to endure imprisonment that will last for years before he will even be tried. And that is just the beginning of what awaits him. Sometimes it's hard to read Acts and know the time frames and where all of the things, because we move on to the next thing, and it's hard to remember how much time passes. And we may not even know where we are in Paul's own story when it comes to the letters that he also wrote. So he's already written, at this point, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. At this point, he's written those. Spoilers, but this jaunt to Jerusalem signifies the end of Paul's freedom in the book of Acts. Every other letter that he writes is going to either be from house arrest or prison in Rome, except for Titus and 1 Timothy during his brief fourth missionary journey that happens after the book of Acts concludes. Paul isn't told, hey, take courage, nothing bad's going to happen to you. It's not what he's told. He isn't promised a resolution that protects his freedom, even though he would very much like that to be the case so that he could continue to preach the gospel, I'm sure. Instead, Jesus says, take heart, you will take this message to Rome. He doesn't say, you will take this message to Rome as a free man. He doesn't say, this will happen quickly. He says, take heart, this is what's coming. He isn't a free man, and it doesn't happen quickly. And so Christ-fueled courage trusts in the sovereignty of God, his means, his timing. And church, are we asking God for that kind of courage when we encounter adversity? Or are we operating out of our own strength, our own means, our own timing, our own understanding? When we became foster parents, we took a lot of leaps of faith. And at different times, one of us was sort of, pulling the other one along. But right at the beginning of that journey, when we got our daughter River, we had a lot of hard things to go through. She had a lot of hard things to go through. And there was a time where Andrea called, and she just said, I don't know, can I do this? She called the agency. And just said, is this, she sat under a tree and she just, she said, Lord, what are you doing? What is the time frame here? We felt like we were languishing, What is the answer? And God just said, hey, I'm with you. And that was the only confirmation we had. We didn't know when, we didn't know how, we didn't know if she was going to get to be ours forever. But he just said, hey, put one foot in front of the other, I'm with you every step of the way. And that's all we got. We had to trust his means, we had to trust his timing. And so I think that's true for all of us. So that's the first one. The second one is that Christ-fueled courage. So first, it trusts in God's means and timing. And second, it is secure in resurrection hope. Christ-fueled courage is secure in resurrection hope. Paul knows the real reason he's there is because of his resurrection hope. He believes not only that Christ rose from the dead, but that one day all who believe will be raised and be changed. He already had written as much in 1 Corinthians 15. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, Hinkle, for the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. Paul already knows that. So those with Christ-fueled courage aren't unafraid of death. They just have resurrection hope. G.K. Chesterton says, courage is an almost contradiction in terms. It means a strong desire to live, taking the form of a readiness to die. Even Christ himself, the night before his death, asked the cup that he was about to drink be taken away. But he persevered and held fast. And because he held fast, we have also attained the resurrection of the dead. Because he himself had resurrection hope. Sergeant Herbert Inglemore and Captain Law P. Knox had this same resurrection hope. His body now lies in a military cemetery in eastern France, there awaiting the resurrection. After the war, his body, like many others, was actually exhumed and laid to rest back here stateside with his family. So he awaits the resurrection here. And they await together. Lastly, and briefly, the band, y'all can go ahead and come up. Christ-fueled courage trusts in God's means and timing. It is secure in resurrection hope, and Christ-fueled courage doesn't come from you, but Christ in you. It's in the name. It's Christ-fueled. Christ's command to Paul to take courage doesn't mean, hey, trust in yourself. You've got this. You can get through this. That's worldly courage. That's not what we're talking about. That's not what's on display. It means trust me. I have a plan, and I will hold you fast. And Paul understood this. In Philippians 1, 19 through 21, written in Rome, still awaiting his appeal to Caesar, he says, "For I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance, as it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not at all be ashamed, but that with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain." And we just sang in the new song. Great job, by the way, guys. That was awesome. To this I hold. My hope is only Jesus. All the glory evermore to him. And when the race is complete, still my lips shall repeat, yet not I, but through Christ in me.